You can vote for president. You can vote for governor. You can vote for Congress. You can even vote for the person deciding whether your county installs another stop sign nobody asked for. But the company deciding whether your electric bill jumps another $40 this summer, that part was mostly decided before you moved in. Welcome to the monopoly nobody remembers agreeing to, because most Hoosiers think electricity works like a market, choice, competition, capitalism. You pick the best option. The best company wins. That's adorable. In reality, most people live inside monopoly utility territories where one company controls the power lines, the infrastructure, the billing, and most importantly, your lack of alternatives. You do not shop for electricity. You inherit it, like allergies or student debt. And every year, the bill gets weirder. Base charge, adjustment fee, transmission cost recovery, fuel surcharge, grid modernization rider. At some point, your electric bill starts reading less like a utility statement, more like someone itemized a hostage situation. Yet somehow, no matter how high the bill climbs, utility companies keep reporting profits. Interesting coincidence. Now, to be fair, utilities are not normal businesses. Electricity is not a luxury. It is survival infrastructure. Heat in the winter, air conditioning in the summer, medical devices, refrigeration, modern life itself. That is why monopolies are allowed to exist in the first place. The original deal was simple. You get monopoly power in exchange for public accountability. That was the bargain. And somewhere along the way, the monopoly stayed. The accountability got negotiable because while your bill rises, utility companies lobby lawmakers, fund campaigns, push legislation, request rate hikes, and operate inside regulatory systems most voters cannot explain without needing emotional support afterwards. That complexity is not accidental because complicated systems protect power, especially profitable power. And here's the part that should bother everyone. These companies are so deeply woven into daily life that politicians barely touch them because angering your utility company is politically dangerous. Nobody wants to be blamed for blackouts. Nobody wants to be blamed for rate instability. So year after year, the public absorbs the increases while executives explain why the increases were necessary. Funny how they are always necessary. Tonight, we are breaking all of it down in how America built utility monopolies, how the system got captured, why your electric bill keeps climbing, who profits from them, and why the average voter has less control over the most important parts of modern life than they probably realize. Because this is not just about electricity, it's about power, literally and politically. And if survival becomes a monopoly, accountability becomes mandatory. Let's begin. Welcome back to Hold 'em Accountable. I'm Derek Holder, retired Marine, political troublemaker, and someone who has looked at an electric bill recently and briefly considered learning how to live inside a cave. Tonight, we are talking about utilities. And I know the second somebody says utility regulation, half the audience immediately starts mentally folding laundry. Stay with me, because this issue affects literally every person watching the show. Rich, poor, Republican, Democrat, urban, rural. Nobody escapes the electric bill. And lately, those bills have started feeling less like monthly expenses, more like ransom demands written by someone with access to your thermostat. Now, here's the important part. This episode is not electric companies bad. That's lazy analysis. Utilities are essential infrastructure. Electric workers matter. Linemen matter. Engineers matter. Grid reliability matters. When storms hit Indiana, these are the people restoring the power while the rest of us are standing in the kitchen pretending opening the fridge every 30 seconds will somehow improve the situation. That work deserves respect. This episode is about structure because the average person thinks they live in an energy market. Most do not. Most people live inside regulated monopoly system where one company dominates a territory and customers have little to no practical ability to choose another provider. That changes the relationship entirely because once competition disappears, accountability becomes everything. And right now, people are asking a very fair question. If these companies are guaranteed customers, why do regular people feel like they are constantly losing? And let's be honest, people are exhausted. Groceries cost more, insurance costs more, housing costs more, childcare costs more. Then summer hits Indiana like Satan opened a hairdryer in the sky. Suddenly, your electric bill arrives looking like a car payment. At some point, people stop asking, how do I save money? And start asking, am I just paying a subscription fee to exist now? That frustration is real. The utilities sit right in the middle of it because the electricity is no longer optional infrastructure. It is survival infrastructure. Heat in winter, air conditioning in summer, medical devices, internet access, remote work, modern life itself. Your electric bill is no longer a bill. It is a subscription to survival. And when survival becomes mandatory, people deserve transparency. So tonight we are going to break this all the way down. How America built utility monopolies, how the original system was supposed to work, how the relationship between utilities, regulators, and lawmakers evolved, why your bill keeps rising, and who benefits when the public is too overwhelmed to follow the money. Because utilities discovered one of the greatest political tricks in modern America. Become complicated enough and nobody notices where the money moves. That ends tonight. Let's start with the history. Because to understand why your electric bill feels like emotional warfare, you have to understand the deal America originally made with utility companies in the first place. To understand why your electric bill feels like a negotiation with a supervillain, we have to go backward, way backward, back to the moment electricity stopped being magic and became infrastructure. Because there was a time in America when electric companies actually competed, sort of, and it was chaos. Different voltages, different wiring systems, different providers carving up cities like raccoons fighting over a trash can behind a Waffle House. It was messy, dangerously messy. So eventually government stepped in and made a decision that would shape the next century of American life. Utilities would become regulated monopolies. That phrase matters because monopoly is usually a bad word unless you add regulated in front of it. Then suddenly everyone in government starts acting like it's a responsible adult decision. The logic actually made sense. Building electric infrastructure is expensive, really expensive. You cannot have 6 competing power all running separate poles and wires down the same street like a spaghetti accident. So the country made a bargain. One company gets exclusive territory. One company builds the infrastructure. One company provides the power. In exchange, government regulates them to protect the public. That was the deal. You get monopoly status, but you do not get to behave like an unchecked corporation. You are supposed to operate like a public necessity. Reliable service, reasonable rates, public oversight. That was the theory. And honestly, for a while, it mostly worked. Electricity spread rapidly. Rural communities got connected. Modern infrastructure expanded. America electrified itself into a global superpower. That part is real. The system accomplished enormous things. Then capitalism smelled guaranteed consumers and things got complicated because utilities realized something beautiful. If you are the only provider in a territory, people cannot leave. And if regulators approve your cost plus guaranteed rate of return, growth becomes very comfortable, not competitive, comfortable. And comfort changes behavior, especially corporate behavior. See, in a real market, companies fear losing customers. That fear creates pressure. Pressure creates competition. Competition creates innovation. But monopoly utilities operate differently. Your power company is not waking up every morning terrified you might switch to electricity plus ultra across town. You usually cannot. Your address determines your provider. That is not capitalism. That is assigned seating. And once consumers cannot realistically leave, the relationship changes entirely. Now the real game becomes regulation, lobbying, rate approvals, infrastructure recovery, long-term guaranteed profit structures, not winning consumers, managing oversight, That's where the modern utility politics begin. And to understand how powerful utilities became, you have to understand something else. Electricity stopped being a convenience. It became necessity. At first, electricity was luxury, lights, appliances, modern novelty. Now, try living without it. Seriously, no refrigeration, no internet, no heating, no air conditioning, no medical devices, no remote work, no functioning modern economy. Electricity became so essential that utility companies effectively turned into private gatekeepers of public survival. That is enormous power. And enormous power requires enormous accountability, or at least it's supposed to. Now, here's where the story starts turning. Because over time, the relationship between utilities and government became less adversarial and more collaborative. Regulators began working closely with utilities. Lawmakers depended on utility expertise. Lobbyists shaped energy policy. Rate structures became more complicated. The system professionalized itself. And whenever systems become highly technical, something dangerous happens. Normal people stop paying attention, not because they're stupid, but because they're busy, trying to survive, raise families, work jobs, pay bills. Nobody gets home from work and says, you know what sounds exciting? A deep dive into utility cost recovery mechanisms. That vacuum matters because complexity protects power. The harder something is to explain, the easier it becomes to manage without public scrutiny. And utility companies became masters of complexity. Now, to be fair, utilities will argue maintaining the grid is expensive. Modernizing infrastructure is expensive. Storm recovery is expensive. And they're right. This is not fake. Infrastructure costs money. The grid does need upgrades. Transmission systems matter. Reliability matters. Nobody wants rolling blackouts because somebody thought the power grid should run on optimism and extension cords. That is real. But here's the tension. When companies are guaranteed customers and guaranteed profit structures, who protects the public from the public utility? That question becomes the entire story. Because the original deal only works if accountability stays stronger than the monopoly. And lately, a lot of Americans are starting to wonder whether that balance still exists at all. The monopoly stayed. The accountability got fuzzy. And that is where we arrive at modern America, especially Indiana. This is the part where utility companies stop looking like infrastructure providers, start looking like political institutions with power plants attached. Because somewhere along the way, the relationship changed. Utilities were supposed to be tightly regulated monopolies. Instead, in many places, they became deeply connected to the people regulating them. Once that happens, accountability gets slippery fast. Now, again, let's be fair. Not every utility executive is sitting in a dark room plotting how to emotionally destroy your thermostat setting. Most people working in utilities are just doing their jobs. But some systems matter more than intentions. And the system created incentives that heavily favor utility companies. Because remember, utilities do not make money the way normal businesses do. They do not compete aggressively for customers. They make money through approved rates, infrastructure spending, regulatory decisions, and guaranteed returns on investments approved by regulators. That changes everything. Because now growth depends less on winning customers and more on influencing the environment approving your profits. That means lawmakers, regulators, lobbyists, rate cases, policy, that becomes the battlefield. And in Indiana, that battlefield has gotten crowded. Utility companies spend heavily on lobbying. They maintain constant relationships with lawmakers. They monitor legislation aggressively, and they operate inside a political reality where very few elected officials actually want a war with the power company keeping the lights on in their district. Because politically, utilities are dangerous opponents. People understand gas prices. People understand grocery prices. But electricity feels unavoidable, which means every rate increase feels personal, especially during summer and winter, when usage spikes and people suddenly discover their HVAC system is apparently powered by liquid gold. Now let's talk about regulators, specifically the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, the IURC. And if your eyes glazed over at the phrase Utility Regulatory Commission, congratulations. You are exactly why utility systems became so powerful. Because utilities figured out one of the greatest political tricks in modern America. Become boring enough and nobody notices the money. That is genius. Terrifyingly genius. And here's the part that should make people sit up a little straighter. The members of the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission are not elected by the public. They are appointed by the governor. That means the people helping decide whether your utility rates rise are selected through political appointment, not direct voter accountability. Now, technically, commissioners are chosen from candidates recommended by a nominating committee and confirmed by the Indiana Senate. And on paper, that sounds balanced, professional, responsible. But here's the uncomfortable reality. Governors appoint people they trust, people they know, people politically aligned with them. Sometimes former insiders, sometimes industry-connected professionals, sometimes people who already move comfortably inside the same political and lobbying circles surrounding utility. That is not automatically corruption, but it absolutely creates proximity between regulators and the industries they regulate. And proximity changes everything fast, because this is the danger of every regulatory structure in America. Eventually, the watchdog starts attending the same conferences as the wolves. Everybody knows each other. Everybody speaks the same language. Everybody talks about stakeholders and cost recovery mechanisms, while ordinary people are sitting at the kitchen table wondering why their bill suddenly looks like a second mortgage payment. That disconnect matters, especially when utility companies spend heavily on lobbying and maintain consistent relationships with lawmakers and regulators. Because ordinary voters do not have lobbyists. Most people cannot spend Tuesday afternoon walking the State House explaining why another utility fee might wreck their grocery budget. Utility companies can and do. Regular people show up to one public hearing if they are lucky. Industry professionals show up every day. That imbalance shapes outcomes whether people want to admit it or not. But let's be honest about something else. Political appointments create political incentives. A governor is unlikely to appoint someone openly hostile to the industries driving major infrastructure investments in the state. That is reality, which means utility regulation often starts from a framework of cooperation, not confrontation. Again, not evil, not conspiracy, incentives, relationships, institutional comfort. And over time, systems built on institutional comfort tend to drift away from ordinary people, especially when those ordinary people only interact with the system once a month through a bill they cannot negotiate and barely understand. That is why trust erodes, not because people think every regulator is corrupt, but because the public increasingly feels like the entire system is talking to itself, and nobody outside the room gets a microphone. The IURC is responsible for approving many rate increases, infrastructure projects, and utility-related regulatory decisions in Indiana. That is enormous power, because when a utility wants to recover costs from customers, that often moves through regulatory approval. And again, to be clear, some of those costs are legitimate. Infrastructure costs money. Storm repairs cost money. Grid modernization costs money. The problem is not that utilities spend money. The problem is how insulated the process feels from ordinary people. Most Hoosiers do not attend rate hearings. Most do not understand the filings. Most do not even know when major utility decisions are being debated. And complexity creates distance. Distance creates disengagement. Disengagement creates room for influence. That cycle repeats over and over and over again. And this is where the bills start getting weird. Because once utilities realized infrastructure investment could help justify rate increases and improved returns, the incentive structure changed. The more approved spending, the more opportunities for recovery. Transmission upgrades, grid modernization, new infrastructure, fuel adjustment mechanism, riders, service fees, cost trackers. At some point, the bill stops looking like a utility statement, starts looking like someone lost a fight with Excel. And ordinary people are expected to just trust the math, even when they cannot afford the outcome. Now layer on lobbying, campaign contributions, industry influence, utility-backed legislation. And suddenly the system starts looking less like consumer protection and more like a negotiation where one side brought lawyers and the other side brought confusion. That is the frustration people feel, not just the bill itself, the helplessness, the feeling that the decision was already made somewhere far above their pay grade. Because for many people, utilities feel untouchable. You cannot realistically leave. You cannot realistically negotiate. And most people do not even know who approved the increases in the first place. That is not a healthy relationship between the public and essential infrastructure. Now, here is the important part. This did not happen overnight. No one woke up and said, let's create a confusing utility system that frustrates everyone by 2026. This evolved slowly, one regulation, one lobbying effort, one approved rate structure, one complicated filing at a time. That is how powerful systems grow, quietly, incrementally, boringly. Until one day people look at a summary electric bill and suddenly realize, wait, who exactly is the system designed for? And once people start asking that question, things get uncomfortable. Now we get to the part everyone actually feels. Not theory, not regulatory philosophy, not utility history. The bill. The monthly jump scare sitting inside your mailbox or email inbox like, good evening, we regret to inform you that existing indoors is now premium content. Because people across Indiana are opening electric bills and asking the exact same question. How is this getting worse every year? And the frustrating part is there's no single answer, which is exactly why utility companies love explaining it. Because once a system gets complicated enough, responsibility becomes foggy, and foggy systems are harder to fight. Now, to be fair, some of these costs are real. Fuel costs fluctuate, infrastructure ages, storm damage is expensive. The electrical grid absolutely needs modernization. America's grid infrastructure is old, like DVD player in a motel room old. And utilities will correctly tell you, upgrading transmission systems, substations, and grid reliability costs money. True. But then we hit the real question. Who pays for it? Because somehow the answer is almost always you. And this is where the average person starts feeling trapped. Because utility companies can request rate increases tied to infrastructure investments and operational costs. Regulators review them. Lawmakers influence the environment around them. And eventually those costs show up on your bill through base rates, riders, adjustment mechanisms, service charges, fuel recovery fees, and transmission cost trackers. At some point, the bill stops feeling readable, starts looking like your accountant is trying to summon something. And then there's summer, Indiana summer. That magical season where humidity becomes a human rights violation. People are running air conditioning because they want to survive, not because they are trying to recreate Antarctica in the living room. And when temperatures spike, usage spikes. When usage spikes, bills explode. Suddenly, families are making choices between comfort and affordability. Lower the thermostat or buy groceries. Run the AC or risk heat exhaustion. That is not inconvenience anymore. That is economic pressure tied directly to survival infrastructure. And the worst part, people often blame themselves first. Maybe I use too much power. Maybe I should unplug one more thing. Maybe my thermostat personally betrayed me. Meanwhile, the larger system quietly keeps shifting costs downward onto customers. Now, let's talk about the next giant issue, data centers, artificial intelligence, massive energy demand growth. Because while ordinary people are trying to keep the lights on affordably, America is entering an energy arms race. AI infrastructure requires enormous energy consumption, massive server farms, constant cooling, huge transmission demand. And states like Indiana are aggressively competing for those projects because they bring investment, supposed jobs, and supposed economic development, which sounds great until somebody has to build the infrastructure to support all that power demand. And that infrastructure is not free. Now, here's the concern experts keep raising. When utilities build massive new infrastructure to support future industrial demand, ordinary ratepayers often absorb part of the cost structure. Translation? Regular people can end up helping finance systems built for giant corporate expansion. Again, not always unfair. Large projects can absolutely strengthen the economy, but transparency matters. People deserve to know who benefits, who pays, whether residential customers are subsidizing growth they may never personally benefit from. Because once AI, industrial expansion, and data center growth collide with aging grids and monopoly utility structures, the public starts feeling squeezed from every direction at once. That pressure is political dynamite waiting for a match. This is why utility frustration feels different than other economic frustrations. You can skip Starbucks. You can delay buying a new TV. You cannot realistically opt out of electricity. That is what makes the system unique. Utility companies are not selling convenience anymore. They are selling participation in modern life itself, which means every increase feels unavoidable. And unavoidable systems create resentment fast, especially when ordinary people feel like they have less control over decisions affecting their own survival. That is where this stops being an economic story and becomes a political one. Because once survival infrastructure becomes unaffordable, people stop asking whether the system works. They start asking who it actually works for. Now we get to the part where the vibes become spreadsheets. And honestly, that's where things usually get worse. Because utility systems survive on complexity, but numbers are harder to hide behind. So let's follow the money. Electric bills rise, public frustration rises, and yet major utility companies continue reporting strong earnings. That disconnect matters because when families feel squeezed while monopoly utilities remain financially stable or highly profitable, people start asking the fair question. If everyone is suffering, why does the system seem designed to protect the company first? Now, to be fair, utilities argue profits are necessary for infrastructure investment and grid reliability. And there is a bit of truth in, but monopoly utilities also operate with protections most industries never receive. Guaranteed customer bases, regulated territories, approved rate structures, and infrastructure cost recovery mechanisms. That creates extraordinary financial stability, which means the public expects extraordinary accountability in return. Utility companies spend heavily on lobbying because utilities do not just operate power plants. They operate inside politics. Legislation matters. Regulatory appointments matter. Rate approval environments matter. And when billions of dollars are tied to policy outcomes, influence becomes part of the business model. Again, this is not unique to Indiana. This happens nationally, but it becomes especially powerful in industries where consumers cannot realistically walk away because consumers do not negotiate with monopoly infrastructure. They absorb it. Most Hoosiers do not attend utility hearings. Most do not track IURC filings. Most do not know when major rate cases are happening. Honestly, why would they? People are busy surviving. That vacuum matters because industries become strongest when the public stops paying attention to the process. And utilities master the art of technical complexity. At some point, the language becomes so technical that ordinary people disengage entirely. And once people disengage, influence concentrates. This might be the biggest receipt of the night. Most people cannot simply switch electric providers. Your utility is largely determined by where you live. Your address decides, not your satisfaction level. That means consumers experience rising prices without the pressure valve normal markets are supposed to create. No meaningful competition, limited consumer leverage, and infrastructure people cannot realistically opt out of. That changes the relationship completely because when consumers cannot leave, accountability has to come from oversight. And if oversight feels weak or politically insulated, public frustration grows fast. This may be the most important receipt of all, though. The system survives partly because it feels too complicated to challenge. People understand groceries. People understand rent. People understand gas prices. Utility regulation feels distant, technical, overwhelming. And complexity protects powerful institutions better than secrecy ever could. Because secrecy makes people suspicious. Complexity makes people tired. That is a much safer environment for institutional power. And utilities figured that out a long time ago. So where does that leave ordinary people? Paying more, understanding less, and feeling disconnected from decisions affecting one of the most essential parts of modern life. That is not sustainable because eventually people stop viewing rising utility bills as unfortunate. They start viewing them as evidence the system itself no longer works for them. Once the public reaches that point, pressure builds fast. Now comes the important part, because if every episode ends with, wow, everything is terrible, eventually people stop listening. Hopelessness is not strategy, and outrage without solutions is just performance art with lower thirds. So let's talk about what actually changes this. And no, the answer is not abolish electricity and return to candlelight. Although, based on some bills recently, candles are starting to look financially competitive. First, transparency. Real transparency. Not 37 pages of technical language buried online 3 days before a hearing nobody knows exists. If utilities want rate increases, the public should clearly understand why, how much, who benefits, and how long it lasts, and who approved it. That should be standard, not investigative journalism, because ordinary people should not need a law degree and an emotional support animal to decode their electric bill. Second, public engagement has to become easier. Most people cannot attend utility hearings at 1:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. They have jobs, kids, lives. The system currently favors the people paid to be there. Utilities have lawyers, lobbyists, policy experts. Ordinary people have 15 minutes during lunch break and a growing sense of panic. That imbalance matters. Public hearings should be accessible online, aggressively publicized, and explained in plain language, because participation only matters if normal people can realistically participate. Third, stronger consumer protection standards, because electricity is not luxury spending. It is survival infrastructure. That changes the moral responsibility entirely. Heat waves kill people. Winter outages kill people. Medical interruptions kill people. When an industry controls infrastructure tied directly to survival, public accountability has to stay stronger than corporate convenience. That means stronger affordable protections, clearer shutoff policies, stronger oversight during extreme weather, and far better protections for vulnerable households. And yes, that may reduce maximum profit potential in certain situations. I'm okay with that, because utilities are essential infrastructure, not casino chips. Fourth, modernize the grid. Absolutely modernize it. This is important because some people hear criticism of utilities and immediately think the answer is pretending infrastructure upgrades are fake. No, the grid is really aging. Extreme weather really is increasing strain. Energy demand is really growing, especially with AI infrastructure and massive data centers entering the equation. Modernization matters. Reliability matters. Resiliency matters. But modernization without accountability becomes a blank check. That is the problem. If consumers are funding infrastructure investments, consumers deserve visible long-term benefits, improved reliability, lower outage risk, transparent timelines, measurable improvements, and real oversight, not endless temporary charges that somehow become permanent roommates on the bill. Fifth, we need clear separation between regulators and industry influence. Now, let me be careful here. This is not me saying regulators are corrupt. It's me saying public trust matters. And trust erodes when industries become too comfortable inside the same political and regulatory circles overseeing them. That means stricter ethics standards, transparency around lobbying, stronger revolving door restrictions, public visibility into appointments, and easier public access to regulatory process, because people should never feel like monopoly utilities and regulators are operating inside the same private club. Once the public starts believing that, trust collapses fast. And finally, people have to stop treating utilities as boring policy. That is the biggest change of all, because utility companies figured out something brilliant decades ago. If people think an issue is too technical, they stop paying attention. And once the public disengages, influence concentrates quietly. Utilities become politically untouchable, partly because everybody else got tired. That has to change, because your utility bill is political. Your rate hikes are political. Your grid reliability is political. Your shutoff protections are political. The problem is not that utilities became political. The problem is that most people were never told they already were. And here's the truth underneath all of this. People do not mind paying for systems they trust. What destroys trust is feeling trapped inside systems they cannot influence, cannot understand, and cannot escape. That's where anger grows. And honestly, people are reaching that point because nobody expects electricity to be free. People just want the relationship to feel fair, transparent, accountable, human. That should not be too much to ask from companies controlling modern survival infrastructure. And if it is, then maybe the system itself needs more than small adjustments. Maybe it needs pressure, public pressure, because powerful systems rarely reform themselves voluntarily. That is history every time. Now it gets to the point where we go into one of the best segments of the show. Hold 'em or fold 'em. You know the rules. If it helps ordinary people keep the lights on without selling a kidney, we hold 'em. If it turns survival infrastructure into a monopoly board with lobbyists, hidden fees, and executive bonuses, we fold them. Tonight, the utility edition. And yes, power companies may wish this segment experienced an unexpected outage. Let's begin. If ordinary people are rationing air conditioning during the heat wave while monopoly utilities remain financially protected, fold it. Again, utilities need revenue. Infrastructure costs money. Grid maintenance matters. Nobody reasonable is arguing electricity should run on positive vibes and extension cords. But when the public feels all the sacrifice flows in one direction, trust dies because monopoly protection without visible public balance starts looking less like infrastructure policy, more like economic gravity pointed downward. Fold it. If your electric bill requires forensic accounting to understand why it jumped $70, fold it. Fuel adjustment charges, transmission riders, service recovery mechanisms, infrastructure trackers. At some point, the bill stops being communication, starts becoming camouflage. Transparency matters. People should clearly understand what they are paying for, why costs increase, who approved it, and how long the charges last. That should not require decoding ancient utility hieroglyphics. Fold the confusion hard. If companies are benefiting from the system are also among the strongest influences shaping the system, that deserves a fold. Not because lobbying is illegal, not because utilities should have no voice, but because monopoly industries require stronger scrutiny than normal industries, not weaker scrutiny. And when ordinary people feel completely disconnected from the process while lobbyists operate full-time inside of it, the public stops believing the system belongs to them. That's dangerous territory. Fold it immediately. Now, let's be fair. The grid absolutely needs modernization. Hold that. Extreme weather is increasing. Energy demand is increasing. AI infrastructure and data centers are increasing demand even further. Pretending the grid can survive indefinitely on outdated infrastructure is fantasy. Modernization matters. Reliability matters. Resilience matters. But consumers funding modernization should see measurable public health benefit in return. Stronger reliability, fewer outages, clearer accountability, and transparent timelines. That's the deal. Infrastructure investment should improve public life, not just shareholder confidence. Hold modernization. Demand accountability with it. This is the easiest hold of the night. Public transparency, accessible hearings, clearer billing, stronger consumer protections, visible regulatory oversight. Hold it all forever. Because utility systems only work long-term if the public trusts them. And trust requires visibility, not mystery, not complexity, not just trust us. Especially when electricity is no longer optional infrastructure. It is survival infrastructure. That changes the responsibility entirely. And if companies want monopoly territory protections, the public deserves monopoly level accountability in return. That's fair. That's reasonable. And frankly, that should already be the standard. So tonight's scorecard. Fold guaranteed comfort for monopoly profits during affordability crises. Fold bills designed acting like accounting escape rooms. Fold utility influence swallowing public accountability. Hold modernization, transparency, consumer protections. Simple, clean, reasonable. Funny how impossible those things suddenly become once billions of dollars enter the room. And now we close this thing out because the real issue here is not electricity. It is power. Who has it? Who profits from it? And who feels completely shut out from the decisions shaping modern survival itself? Most Americans grow up believing freedom means choice. Pick your job, pick your house, pick your leaders, pick your future. But then adulthood arrives like a jump scare wrapped in monthly invoices. And suddenly you realize some of the most important systems in your life were chosen long before you got there. Your healthcare network, your internet provider, your insurance options, and for most people, your electric company. You do not really choose the monopoly. You inherit it. And that changes the relationship entirely because electricity is not a luxury anymore. It is survival infrastructure, heat, air conditioning, medical equipment, food storage, internet access, modern life itself, which means when the bill rises, people do not experience it as an inconvenience. They experience it as pressure, pressure on families, pressure on seniors, pressure on working people already juggling groceries, housing, childcare, insurance, and wages that somehow still feel trapped in 2013. That pressure adds up quietly, month after month, bill after bill, and eventually people stop asking, why is the electricity expensive? And they start asking, who exactly is the system working for? That's the dangerous moment. Not because people are angry, but because people stop trusting. And once public trust collapses around essential infrastructure, rebuilding it becomes brutally difficult. Now, let me be fair one last time. Utilities matter. The workers matter. The infrastructure matters. Nobody wants a collapsing grid. Nobody wants blackouts. Nobody wants to discover the energy system is being maintained with duct tape and motivational speeches. Investment matters. Modernization matters. Reliability matters. But monopoly power only works morally if accountability stays stronger than the monopoly itself. That was the original deal, and people increasingly feel like that balance has drifted. Not because of one evil company, not because of one villain in a boardroom petting a cat, because systems naturally protect themselves over time, especially profitable systems, especially complicated systems, especially systems most people are too exhausted to follow closely. That is how power quietly consolidates in America, not dramatically, administratively. And maybe that's the biggest lesson tonight. The most powerful systems in America are often the ones nobody talks about at all, not because they are unimportant, but because they are too embedded to notice till pressure becomes unbearable. Utilities figured out something decades ago. If people think an issue is boring enough, technical enough, or complicated enough, they stop paying attention. And once the public disengages, influence fills the vacuum quietly, efficiently, professionally. That's not conspiracy. That is institutional gravity, and it exists everywhere. Utilities, healthcare, insurance, housing. Systems drift toward concentrated power unless the public pushes back. That is history every time. And here's the part I want people to remember. Nobody expects electricity to be free. People just want the relationship to feel fair, transparent, accountable, human. That should not be radical, especially for companies controlling infrastructure people literally cannot live without. Because when survival becomes tied to monopoly systems, accountability stops being optional. It becomes mandatory. And if the public is expected to carry the cost, the public deserves a seat at the table, not just another bill in the mailbox. So tonight, remember this. Your electric bill is not just economics. It's policy. It's regulation. It's lobbying. It's infrastructure. It is political power translated into monthly payments. Once you understand that, you stop seeing the bill as random. You start seeing the system behind it. That is where accountability begins. Because the moment people understand how power works, power gets nervous. And honestly, good. It should. So stay informed, ask questions, and as always, hold them accountable.